The Battle of Manchuria. In Manchuria, Stalin unleashed a surprise ambush in which, taking advantage of Japanese confusion, he crushed their forces in a matter of days. The nighttime attack, combined with relentless weather and lethal infiltration tactics, completely paralyzed the enemy army. In minutes, the Soviets sabotaged key communications and dismantled the most critical defensive points, sealing a lightning victory that marked the military history of these great historical enemies. In the Manchuria campaign of 1945, the Soviet army faced thousands of offensive tasks. One of the most difficult was to pierce the imposing Japanese defenses in eastern Manchuria. Under the best conditions, a penetration operation can be costly, but a Manchurian summer can make the task doubly difficult. Only intensive planning, meticulous preparation, and shrewd leadership of the offensive could produce positive results. Such was the challenge faced by the Fifth Army of the Soviets. The most direct route of approach from the Soviet Far East to eastern Manchuria was through the hills of eastern Manchuria from Harbin in the Central Valley, via Mutanxiang, across the Soviet Far Eastern border at Swifenho, and in the valley of the Ussuri River to the north of Vladivostok. Welcome to Frontline War Memoirs. The Eastern Manchurian Railway followed this route, and the Japanese had fortified some of the most formidable defensive positions in Manchuria, demonstrating the strategic value of this approach. Anchored at Swifenho, these Japanese fortifications dominated the approach to eastern Manchuria in a manner very similar to how the Maginot Line channeled the main approaches to the east of France in 1940. On the flanks of this fortified area of Manchuria were dense forests and rugged mountains that the Japanese considered impenetrable to modern mobile armies and difficult to traverse even for infantry. Apparently, few Japanese military thinkers reflected on the French experience on similar terrain adjacent to the Maginot Line in 1940. The Soviets studied the Battle of France better than the Japanese, and they emulated the German feat of 1940 by crossing the difficult terrain of Manchuria and carrying out an operational envelopment of the Japanese forces in the border areas. Contemplating deep operations against strategic objectives, they could not afford to leave large concentrations of Japanese forces on the communication and supply routes of their rear. The Soviets simultaneously carried out shallow envelopment tactical operations against the fortified regions in order to isolate and destroy them with minimal cost. The Far Eastern Command entrusted the task of penetrating the Japanese defenses in eastern Manchuria to the Far Eastern Front under Marshal K.A. Meretskov. The Stavka Directive of the 28th of June of 1945 defined the mission of the front: to deliver the main blow with two armies in the direction of Mutanxiang, to penetrate into the fortified border regions, and to reach a line from Poli through Mutanxiang to Wangqing between the 15th and the 18th day of the operation. After consolidating its forces on the western bank of the Mutan River, as well as at Wangqing and Yanqi, the front would continue the offensive toward Kirin, Changchun, and Harbin. Armies separated on each flank would support the main attack of the Fifth Army. Marshal Meretskov planned to deploy his front in a single echelon of armies. He designated the Fifth Army of General Krylov to carry out the main attack in coordination with the First Red Banner Army of General Beloborodov. The Fifth Army would attack in the direction of Mutanxiang, penetrate the border defenses in a sector of 12 kilometers to the north of Grodokova, destroy the Japanese resistance center of Volinsk, Kwanyuetai, in the fortified border region, and advance 40 kilometers to secure the pass at Taipinling and Swifenho on the fourth day. Meretskov expected the Fifth Army to advance between 60 and 80 kilometers in depth and to secure the crossing of the Muleng River in the vicinity of Muleng by the 8th day of the operation. By the 18th day, the army was to have secured Mutanxiang on the Mutan River, this in conjunction with the First Red Banner Army advancing on Mutanxiang from the northeast. Once Mutanxiang was secured, Marshal Meretskov planned for the 10th Mechanized Corps to develop the offensive to Kirin. where it would meet with the forces of the Trans-Baikal Front advancing through the mountains of the Great Khingan from the east. On the other hand, the front's headquarters provided extensive engineering support to the Fifth Army to overcome the formidable terrain, assist in conducting nighttime battles, and help reduce the fortified positions. The engineers carried out reconnaissance, installed camouflage, and repaired and built roads and bridges, defensive positions, and exit lines. When the attack began, the sapper engineer units, as part of the more than 100 assault groups formed in the Fifth Army, participated in the reduction of the fortified positions. To complement the work of the assault units, the Fifth Army created 2 obstacle-clearing detachments in each first-line rifle company. In the rear of each rifle regiment, road and bridge detachments were formed, composed of a battalion of riflemen and of 1 to 3 sapper platoons to repair transportation routes and facilitate the movement of artillery. In the afternoon of the 8th of August, once preparations for the attack were completed, the battle echelons of the Fifth Army, shrouded in the anonymity of darkness and soaked by the August rains, rested in their jump positions and awaited the order to advance. On the other side of the border, 2 or 3 kilometers away, the Japanese rested quietly, occupying only selected firing positions in their fortified zone, perhaps lulled both by the security of the rain and darkness, and by hopes of a postponed battle as well as by a state of torpor. The events of the early hours of the 9th of August would take advantage of that Japanese complacency. Farther back, in the Japanese rear, similar attitudes were apparent. Along with other division commanders of the Fifth Army and a chief of staff, the commander of the 124th Infantry Division was attending a 5-day conference and table maneuvers in Yeho, the Japanese headquarters of the Fifth Army. At 1 o'clock on the 9th of August, the forward battalions of the Soviet Fifth Army, with supporting tanks and self-propelled guns, crossed the border and, in darkness and under a heavy downpour, slowly moved toward the Japanese positions. They advanced without artillery preparation, almost in silence, as the torrential rain muffled the sounds of their movements. During the early hours of their advance, only the scattered fire from machine guns and the explosions of grenades interrupted the silence, as the Soviet assault units invaded many Japanese positions that had been caught unawares. The forward battalions were distributed in assault groups to destroy individual Japanese positions. When possible, they infiltrated through gaps in the Japanese defenses to threaten the vulnerable flanks of individual defensive positions and to gain the rear of the defenses. These forward battalions took many positions before the Japanese could occupy them. They took others by surprise after brief and intense combats. In some of the main strongpoints, the Japanese reacted quickly, occupied all defensive positions, and offered strong opposition. In the sector of the 65th Rifle Corps, on the right flank of the Fifth Army, the forward battalions of the 190 and 97 Rifle Divisions advanced through very wooded and mountainous terrain to envelop the Camel outpost from the north. At 4 o'clock, they had penetrated into the forest to a depth of between 4 and 6 kilometers, crossed the Shunlianshuan River, and occupied positions in the rear of Camel. Simultaneously, the forward battalion of the 144th Rifle Division, under the command of Commander Glazunov, attacked the front of the Camel outpost. The Japanese managed to occupy all positions inside Camel and successfully repelled Commander Glazunov's initial attack. At 11 o'clock, the forward battalion, with tanks and 152mm self-propelled guns in support, was ready to resume the attack. After an intense 10-minute artillery preparation, Commander Glazunov sent his 4th and 5th companies against the front of Camel, while the direct fire of his tanks and self-propelled guns covered the assault. The 6th Company attacked Camel from the south. The simultaneous assault took control of 4 outposts, killed 100 Japanese, and paved the way for the advance of the main force of the 144th Rifle Division. South of the Volinka River, the forward battalions of the 215 and 63 Rifle Divisions of the 72 Rifle Corps advanced against the Sharp, Ofitserskaya, and Pear outposts. The 3rd Battalion of the 707 Rifle Regiment of the 215 Rifle Division set out at 1 o'clock as the forward battalion to secure the Japanese positions at Sharp. The company of Captain Sherbakov of the 3rd Battalion of the 707 Rifle Regiment would attack the main Japanese defensive position at Sharp. Throughout the 8th of August, the officers of Captain Sherbakov's company studied the terrain and defences and devised a plan to approach the strong point and reduce it. Thus, at 1 o'clock, the company's reconnaissance units advanced in the darkness, guided by the azimuth of a compass. As they advanced, they laid telephone cables so that the lead platoon could follow them. Other platoons followed in column. Each soldier carried an automatic weapon with 300 cartridges, a knife, and between 6 and 8 hand grenades. They advanced linked hand in hand to avoid getting lost in the darkness and rain. Around 3 o'clock, while the sappers were cutting and marking the route through the barbed wire and the minefield, the company approached the strong point. At 3:15, Captain Sherbakov's platoons had surrounded the strong point, and other companies of Captain Moskalev's battalion were in position to assault Sharp. That coordinated assault began shortly after 3:15 without the support of self-propelled guns or tanks, whose advance was hindered by the marshy terrain. Using explosives, backpack flamethrowers, gasoline bottles and hand grenades, the forward battalion secured around one half of the outposts and firing positions at Sharp at 5 o'clock in the morning. The forward battalion of the 63 Rifle Division had occupied the officer outpost immediately adjacent to Sharp and was preparing the way for the main elements of the division to advance through the gap between the Sharp and Pear outposts. The Soviet nighttime assault completely surprised the Japanese. Since the time of the attack was at night, the weather conditions and the style of infiltration of the assault caused a general paralysis among the Japanese. The Soviets quickly cut off enemy communications in many important defensive sectors. Thus, Japanese commanders at all levels had, at best, an inaccurate picture of the fighting. The Japanese never recovered from this initial shock, and their paralysis and inability to respond effectively to the Soviet attacks persisted throughout the remainder of the campaign. Bearing witness to that confusion, the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Japanese Army declared that the offensive by the Soviet forces was so unexpected that the Army's General Staff, during the course of the night from the 8th to the 9th of August until 12 o'clock on the 9th of August, did not know, nor could obtain, any news about what was happening on the border and what the position of the units was. The 5th Japanese Army received notification of the attack by telephone shortly after 1 o'clock. The initial reports from the border sectors mentioned overflights of the border region and Soviet bombardments of Japanese positions at Hutu. The 5th Army reported the incidents to the 1st Area Army and convened the Chiefs of Staff and the division commanders for a meeting. At 3 o'clock in the Yeho Officers' Club, the commander of the 5th Army informed the assembled commanders that artillery bombardments were taking place and that an element of his Soviet infantry appeared to have crossed the border. While the Japanese were reacting to the events in the early hours of the 9th of August, the Soviet offensive was accelerating in a crushing manner against the Imperial Army. The forward battalions completed the process of cutting corridors through the fortified Japanese positions even as the units of the main force began to advance, thereby putting an end to the Japanese occupation in Manchurian territory. However, on the 6th of August, the United States launched the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima. 2 days later, and with Stalin following the agreements that had been reached as already described, he declared war on Japan, and on the 8th initiated the Soviet invasion of Manchukuo and the north of Korea, with the Operation August Storm or Battle of Manchuria. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States had decided on the division of Korea into 2 zones to facilitate the Japanese surrender and to establish a provisional administration in the occupied zones. The division was carried out along the Parallel 38, which will remain to this day, despite the continuous invasions by one side and the other. From the 4th to the 12th of February of 1945, the chiefs of the 3 principal allies met in Yalta in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Among their agreements, the intention to keep Germany united as well as to eradicate from it Nazism and its intellectual and economic authors stood out. The country would be administered temporarily by England, the United States, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in zones that were delimited. It was also agreed that the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would participate in the war against Japan 3 months after the cessation of hostilities in Europe. The Allied advance continued. Russians and Americans met on the Elbe. In the last days of April, the Soviets penetrated Berlin, which fell on the 2nd of May. Hitler and some of his closest associates committed suicide a few days earlier. On the 8th of May, the remainder of the German army surrendered, with the exception of the unit deployed in Czechoslovakia, which did so on the 9th. Thus ended the armed struggle in Europe. In July and August of 1945, in the German city of Potsdam, the final meeting of the Big Three took place. On this occasion, Truman replaced the late Roosevelt. Churchill was displaced by Attlee due to the outcome of the elections in England. Stalin continued to head the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Yalta agreements were confirmed and refined. France would participate in the occupation of Germany, and in part the borders of Poland were agreed upon. On the 8th of August of 1945, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics declared war on Japan, and its troops occupied Manchuria, the southern part of the island of Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and penetrated into the north of Korea. In 1948, the United States imposed a loyal government in the south, which was responded to by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, with the handing over of the north to the Korean Communist Party, led by Kim Il-sung. The Soviet troops withdrew from Korea, whereas the American ones, although reduced in number, remained in the southern peninsula. Historically, Korea has been a disputed zone between China and Japan. At the end of the 16th century, Japan invaded the peninsula with the purpose of annexing it and using it as a base to attack China, which gave rise to the First Korean-Japanese War, won by Korea with the support of the Chinese Empire, to which it was tributary. The Japanese army was able to be expelled thanks to the Korean naval dominance, which prevented Japan from sending supplies and reinforcements to its troops. From then on, Korea became a vassal of China, a situation that lasted until China's defeat in the Chinese-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, and Russia's defeat in the War of 1905. These defeats left Korea in the hands of Japan, which formally annexed the peninsula in 1910. During the Japanese occupation, Korea was used as a platform for the invasion. Manchuria had always constituted a territory of interest for 3 states: China, Japan, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was traditionally considered Chinese territory, but it enjoyed autonomy. Since time immemorial, it has been under Chinese domination, and from a historical, ethnic, and political point of view, it is part of China. Economically, it was a fertile region, susceptible to significant development. Manchuria was the object of constant aggressions and violations by Japan and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, from which China tried to defend itself as far as possible, taking into account that its internal situation suffered from a serious imbalance that facilitated the instability of the 3 eastern provinces. This situation would lead to the development of 2 conflicts in the interwar period: the Chinese-Russian conflict in 1924 and the Chinese-Japanese conflict in 1931. As is known, it was in 1931 that the Japanese government approved the intervention of its army in the Chinese territory of Manchuria. 1 year later, this territory would become a satellite state and receive the name Manchukuo. To this territory, others were added, and in 1937, the war against China broke out. The Chinese resisted valiantly and, despite lacking airplanes, anti-tank cannons, or modern weapons of any kind, they continued resisting for more than 1 month. At the end of February, after suffering very heavy losses, they were forced to withdraw from their strongholds in the Bay of Wusung and occupy positions about 20 kilometers from the coast. At the beginning of 1932, the Japanese created the puppet state of Manchukuo. 1 year later, the Chinese province of Johor was annexed, and the Japanese troops, advancing into defenseless regions, reached as far as the Great Wall of China. This aggressive conduct coincided with the increase of Japanese power in the Far East and with its new naval position in the oceans. Subsequently, the situation of the Japanese army was not much better. Although they were still strong in numbers, these forces were scattered throughout China and Southeast Asia or languished on remote islands, out of reach of any support. The most sensible Japanese leaders began to seek some way to end the war, but their military machine was too powerful for them. The High Command sent reinforcements from Manchuria and ordered fighting to the end, both in Formosa and in the Philippines. There, and also in Japan, the troops were willing to fight to the death. The Japanese Admiralty was no less determined. They reasoned that if they lost the imminent battle for the islands, they would cease receiving oil from the Dutch colonies of Indonesia. It made no sense, they said, to keep the ships if they did not have fuel. Prepared for sacrifice, though with hopes of achieving victory, in August they decided to launch the entire fleet into battle. However, it was evident that the Soviet government was determined to attack Japan once Hitler was defeated, which would have an immense value in shortening the entire struggle. It was convinced that the agreements reached regarding the Balkans were unsurpassable. It was on the 2nd of September of 1945 when Joseph Stalin read this speech to his people. "Comrades," he proclaimed, "the Second World War has ended." The dictator had reason to be proud. His Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had won the greatest and most terrible contest in the history of humanity. On the night from the 8th to the 9th of May of 1945, Germany had surrendered. Hitler had committed suicide earlier, on the 30th of April, while the Red Army was assaulting Berlin in an incredibly costly battle that continued until the 2nd of May. 1 week later, on the 9th, the most destructive land campaign in history ended. 4 months later, Japan followed the German example. Its war economy had collapsed, its navy and air force could barely operate, having been dismantled by American supremacy by air and sea, and the country had been subjected to constant aerial attacks since June of 1944. On the 6th of August, the United States Air Force unleashed over Hiroshima a new and terrifying weapon. On the 9th of August, the Soviet units launched themselves in a whirlwind over Manchuria, and the soldiers of the Japanese Imperial Army there were swept away by the Red Army. On that same day, the North Americans dropped their second atomic bomb, this time over Nagasaki. The government of Japan, facing this simultaneous onslaught from all directions, threw in the towel. On the 15th of August, the Emperor announced the surrender. On the 2nd of September, the Minister of Foreign Affairs signed the official document. The Second World War had finally ended. Without a doubt, this was a severe setback for the Japanese Empire, since historically Japan had coveted Soviet lands for a long time, and Stalin knew it. But he calculated that the Eastern imperialists would not attack the Soviets while they were occupied in China, as was reflected in August of 1937, when the Soviet government signed the Treaty of Mutual Non-Aggression with China, with which it expected the Chinese nationalist cabinet to block Japan, thus preventing it from threatening the Soviet eastern flank. But if even so Tokyo decided to attack, the Soviets would be prepared. Hence the deportation of the Koreans, whom Stalin considered a potential fifth column, internal enemies who could support the Japanese invaders. The Soviet participation in the Second World War began in 1937 with its intervention in the Asian conflict, a defensive war in the East. Stalin provided aid to China and undertook an ethnic cleansing and a concentration of troops to protect the eastern flank. Shortly thereafter, in 1938 to 1939, the Red Army waged a border war, often forgotten but crucial, against Japan, the battles of Lake Jasan and of Jalgin-Gol. Next came an offensive war in Europe, where the Soviets joined the Germans in the dismantling of Poland in September of 1939. Then they attacked Finland alone in the Winter War, 1939 to 1940, and annexed Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the north of Bukovina and Bessarabia in 1940. In the third phase, initiated in the summer of 1941, the Soviets found themselves back on the defensive in their catastrophic campaign against the Germans. The fourth phase, which began at the beginning of 1943, witnessed the Soviet victory in a war of attrition against Germany, and, after the victory in Europe, an offensive war against Japan in the summer of 1945. The final phase consisted of the pacification and reorganization of the territories. It began with the liberation of territories initiated in 1943 and ended in the core with the abolition of food rationing in 1947 and the conclusion of mass demobilization in 1948. Meanwhile, on the western borders, another aspect of the Soviet war came to the forefront. The conventional Soviet campaign against Germany and Japan was intertwined with a series of civil struggles against groups of the population, some of whom were armed and resisting, but many others were simple civilians considered enemies of the Soviet power due to their sociological or national profile. The civil strife continued until 1949, when the large-scale deportations in the West and the victory of the Chinese Communists in the East put an end to the Soviet Second World War.